we're back. Georgia, welcome to the show.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. People say it's about every podcast they're on, but I'm stoked for this one because, I'm glad we can break down the myth that hardcore and business can coexist in the same place, so thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And the idea that hardcore and business, it's funny because it's just hardcore business money and all that, but it's what are you talking about? It's it is actually an established thing at this point. And I think the more you talk about it, the more you can set good guiding principles. You can have healthy conversations rather than talking around things. And also I just think your story and what you have done and are doing is really cool. So thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that.
For the uninitiated, for the people who wouldn't know, because although you're very active online, what you do is often in support of people who are actually up on the stage. So tell us a bit about yourself and what you're doing professionally today.
So there's a couple of aspects to sort of do a bit of a career rewind, if you will. It was 2009. I watched the movie Almost Famous. I was like, if that kid can get away with being a journalist at 15, I can get away with being a journalist at 15. So I went and freelanced it. I got an internship at Aram and built it out. And what was great about that part of my journey is I started off on the introducing desk. That's where it was. And I was at first I was oh man, the introducing desk. I came in to work with Metallica, but I was I've always been an ambitious kid. And, my old man, he's a big punk and hardcore fan. So he was you got to go find the next so-and-so. So I was rewind it a bit. You got to be humble. You got to be real to what you do. So fast forward freelancing a couple of years for various other magazines and titles, I was very much hey, this is what I do. I would like to write this for you. I think I was sort of blindly pitching before I knew what pitching was as a journalist and as a photographer, and again, that comes from sort of an ethos that I have with imagery that I'll go into a bit later on. So I ended up getting into that. Further explain it is, started off in journalism and then come 2012, bands like Comeback Kid were playing down at the Underworld, and then they weren't getting much press around it, just because Victory Records, it's they had a great big presence, but not too much with the UK press. And, I worked for many, many years with the head of PR over there, and we're still very good friends. And, we've had this discussion for a lot. We definitely had a dependable relationship of the magazine doing stuff for Victory bands. So there was that. And at the time, I was across the road with Suicide Silence, the original lineup. And Mitch had just done an interview with a major title that I won't name. And he comes down the stairs and he was pissed. He was peeved. And he was oh, I've just been asked the same questions over and over again. And he's this straight up. I always say that the magazine's a joke that's gone too far. And whenever something big happens, I say this thing of this has gone too far. Because he was he joked with some intent, was you should start your own magazine. And I was do you know what? We should do it, because on the bill at the time, you had all these bands that would become the future headliners. You had the Amures and the These Nuts. And, for people that aren't into this music, these are the people that are now headlining what that headline band was doing. So I was yeah, okay, let's jump into it. Let's do it. And I went about figuring out how do you print, or mates bands. I'd be hey, if I shoot your promos, can you design this magazine? Because I want to use a graphic designer and stuff like that. So it embodied that ethos of punk and hardcore that my father instilled in me. Now, what was great about growing up in a household like that, my parents, my mum was very much a Red Hot Chili Peppers, The Clash, would go to the Rock Against Racism shows. And then my dad was into, many years later revealed to me at least, he was into his Youth of Today's and Shelters and...
No way.
Yeah, the Gorillas, but also Gorillas and Joy Division, and he grew up in the north of England. So he always had this, he loved his music, but he also wanted to achieve and do stuff in his life. So he was very ambitious, and he did that by taking his applied ethos he'd learned through this music and becoming a consultant for businesses. So that inspired my mindset of okay, you can't just do one thing in music. It's I'm a journalist, I'm working with this other magazine. Hey, my friend's band is great. Why not connect these people? And further along in my career, meeting people Andrew Neufeld, a Comeback Kid, and, Sam Siegler and stuff like that does, Youth of the Day and things. They really encouraged me to take that step forward into further helping people. And that led to my current love of music being reinstated. Not that it ever dropped off, but, 10 years into the magazine game, it's okay, got to keep this fresh. And that went into artist management. And that was finding people like Endgame or XL Life, where you have these really honest conversations with them about, what they've come across in the music industry, what they want to see changed. And, I've done it for a couple of bands, even when I'm not managing them, is sat in on their label talks with them to make sure the label's not ripping them to shreds, which has been very, very rare situations, but so that someone's in their corner without paying for a solicitor. And that led to what I did my degrees in, and, music industry management, and then applying that. And I remember when the time came to go to university, I was almost late to the game. I was almost very late. I almost missed the cut-off line to go to uni. My sister had been accepted for a degree. My brother had already done his foundation, was on to his degree. And I was working with a band at the time, and their manager was like, hey, I run a course. If you come on this degree, you can basically tour for 3 years, and I'll just check you into like your, and I was the same as what you have with your band. So I was learning a lot on the road. And that led to artist management. It was like anything I try to do is the intent of, how can you further give back to that community? And then also, I really enjoy business. All my childhood, to my poor parents' ears, I tried to learn every instrument under the planet, and I was terrible, absolutely terrible. Maybe a bit of bass I can get away with now, but so I was like, right, I really want to be involved in this incredible thing that gives me an incredible feeling. And it was being a go-getter from that. And it was like, okay, artist management, photographer, hey, you need a videographer recently, out with Comeback Kid. I was like, screw it, I'm going to pick up a camera and sit post-tour and in between tours and learn how to do video editing. And basically that's what it is. It's like a one job does it, fix for everything in music right now. But in the artist corner, and sometimes the labels will ask me to come in and consult on like a certain release, or, someone to get signed, and they'll say, hey, it's very different from what Roadrunner usually signs or Pure Noise normally signs. Like, what are your thoughts on this? So yeah, it's just, I've been very lucky to make a career out of helping people and then constantly learning and applying those skills to help others as well.
Yeah. Well, and I want to give 3 shout outs since you named 3 bands that I care about. So shout out Comeback Kid, Andrew, all the crew there. I love you guys. Shout out Endgame, Spencer. Endgame is sick though. And then shout out XL Life. I love that band. Like when you posted it, I was like, what is this? And it's sick. It's so good. I love that band. All right, let's go back to you though. I want to go right back to when you were this young kid that's like, oh, I want to do that. It takes a lot of daring to put your hand up or to kind of like barge in the door, put your foot in the door and do that. But it takes way more guts to handle rejection, people trying to diminish you, shut you down. So let's go back to when you first said like, hey, I want to come in and freelance, or I want to write, or I want to be a part of this. How hard was that for you? What was the process that you took, and what was the reception to that?
So where I grew up was a very, so my parents were both working. We used to say that we were working class in disguise, because where we grew up was sort of very middle class. And so like a lot of people around me, I didn't connect with many people. Funnily, some of them are now in Desolate that I ended up connecting with in music-wise. That was when we were kids. But there wasn't a lot of people that was into what I was doing and understood it. So I remember I'd go and buy Kerrang magazine every single week. If I was overseas, because, my parents lived apart and I was going to see my dad, my mum would still, bless her, go out of the way and go get Kerrang for me. So I was like always feeding this knowledge. And I discovered places like All Ages Records in Camden. And, years later, actually ended up working for Nick. And I'd be like, hey, I've got £15. What's cool? He's like, check out Rancid, check out stuff like this. So it was taking that. And then, as a kid, because I couldn't get into like playing the stuff, I couldn't learn a Gorilla Biscuits riff. I'd sit there and pull apart like, oh, they're telling you to just go get it. And, I think having been raised in a household that celebrated this music instilled a really good, like, go get it influence and stuff like that. But my dad has been a big influence in my career, in my life. He always said, like, as a kid growing up, even if I'd have like an argument with my sister, he'd be like, don't stress yourself out. You're going to give yourself a heart attack. That fast forward to 2018, I had one, but that's again, further down the line. So like when I was younger, it was like, okay, it's not the end of the world. And I think as well, it's always been a way of just saying, well, this is what I want to do in life. Who has the right to take that away from me? Whether it's someone saying, you can't call that band a punk band, or nah, sorry, we don't want to do this, we don't like your writing style. I'm like, okay, well, I'll just try elsewhere. And I think it is, from the get-go, I realized that music was something very hard to break into. My parents were always talking about it. They were fortunately very encouraging. They were like, originally I wanted to work in the film industry. That was my dream, was to be a film director. And I remember my dad sat me down. It was like me and my twin sister. He's always like trying to encourage us to be realistic, but chase our dreams in a realistic way. And he was like, okay, think about how you'd go about doing that. Would you go get an internship? Would you go get this? So that's what I did. And I sat down, and the back pages of Kerrang magazine used to have the address for Mapping House. So I'd ring them every day, every single day. They probably have voicemails of this. And I'd be like, hey, I'm interested for like my school work experience. Everyone was going to like the local supermarket or whatever. I was like, no, this is my golden window. Like I said, I just watched Almost Famous and I was like, this is it. So like rang them and was like, hey, look, please take a chance on me. So eventually they agreed to like have a conversation with me. And I went down and I spent the night before getting like a ring binder together of like every magazine cover that I'd collected of theirs. Like 2 seconds into opening that, they were like, okay, fine, like what dates do you need? This is it. So I ended up doing that. But it was also, what was interesting was like, it may be a very different team now. So this is just reflecting on my own experience there. It's like, I didn't see much interaction between the people that were working there. It was sort of, I had to get up and go ask the graphic designer what he was doing, or the photo desk, Caroline at the time, I had to be like, hey, what are you doing? And that was sort of, there was a couple of like magical moments in that. So Becky Sugden, who's a big booking agent, and I, love her to pieces. She was in the elevator one day, the same time as me, and I was like, "Hey, what is it that you do?" I'm quite a sociable person. I think that's carried me through. That when someone's like, one person says no, it's like go ask the other person. And sometimes that's got me in trouble. Where a publicist is like, "We don't want to do this," and the band are like, "We want to do it." I'm like, "Yeah, should we go do it then anyway?" And then you get the backlash of saying, No, you shouldn't have done that. Do you know what? Sometimes people say you shouldn't have got into working in music at such a young age. I was like 15, so I grew up. But I'm glad I did. I got my partying stages out of the way. I wasn't drinking underage per se, but by the time I was 18 and had a year of after parties, I was like, this has no interest to me. Or growing up through it, like even now, the publicist that I just got for XL Life, it's like, she's seen me grow up as a person, so I have full, complete trust in her and that she'll represent my bands properly. So like for me, it's always been about spinning those positives and always being thankful for like what I have and keeping, and not to be cliche, but like keeping that positive mental attitude, because I think there was a lot of people I've met in music that had ways of coping with the stress through bad habits, and I think seeing that very young. Granted, it could cause trauma for some people. It could cause, like, I don't want to get involved with this, or my parents don't want me involved with this. It made me go like, okay, I can be the change in that. And I think a big thing is every time a local band that turned into some of these bigger bands over the years, again, I supported them early on. So as they grew and, the While She Sleeps and stuff like this, they were very lucky to take me for that ride. So I think to go back to your original question, yeah, it did take a lot. And like, I look back and there are some days where I'm like, man, I need that 15-year-old me to come into the room right now and tell me to, screw it, go for it.
Yeah.
But I think that comes down to like, I grew up in a household of, and I grew up with a twin sister. It's so annoying that like everything I was doing up until that point in my life, I had to have another human being attached to it. So I was like, I'm kicking and screaming to make my own noise. It means that I really have to go do it. She has no interest in being in music or coming after me. So I got to run and grab it whilst I can,
Heck yeah. So a lot of people who are involved, like, because you'd said you're also initially interested in film. A lot of people who are involved in film, music, the arts in general, to typically, not always, but typically come from a little bit of an outsider perspective. So when you were young, were you like within group, or were you a bit of an outsider?
I was one of these people that would drift amongst groups of friends. And it's even like that in my life now. I've got like 5 really solid core people in my life. And I've been a firm believer in like, again, being raised in a working class family. It's like quality over quantity. But I've always just had a way of getting on with people. And so for me, yeah, I think growing up in an area, there was like a really hard line divide almost on this one street of like, okay, the super working class people and the super high-end conservative, I guess Republican in America, if you will, side of the world. And so it was like that kind of balance. Like, I used to always say to people when they say, what does your dad do? It's like, yeah, he's consulting for some major companies, but I used to say he's a punk rock guy in a suit, 9 to 5. So I think, yeah, like you said, with filming stuff, for me, you fall into music as escapism. And I was always just mind blown by that in films that like, for 15 minutes of watching a TV series or hour and a half of watching a film, I was like, that's a really great gift to leave behind in terms of legacy, So I think even from a young age, that's something I've always been very aware of as well, is like, we are here for a limited period of time. No one's going to remember you if you did their taxes for them. Like, no offense to accountants, but like, I could have gone down that route and done everyone's taxes for them. Granted, that's great, but you're not leaving too much behind in the sense that, you've helped elevate tomorrow's headliners and stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate my accountant.
Yeah, no, oh my gosh, I love you. Shout out, Jill. You're the best. Thank you for doing my tax return just now.
Thank you so much. I could never do that.
Yeah, please never leave.
What I'm really interested in is Like you got involved in all of this when like music started going through a bit of a crisis, and that crisis heightened, and then there was like print, like print starts going the way of the dinosaur. You get involved in music as a career and start a print magazine. Why?
Right, let's take it back to 2012, right? Bridge 9 was still a thing in the sense that they were pumping out a lot of great records. Bands like Dead Swans were around, bands like Comeback Kid, and I was getting peeved that these other magazines, like not peeved that they were doing so well, but they just weren't understanding. Right, let me go back a second and reword this. Think about right now, right? The way that I explain this to people now, everyone's jumping on Turnstile. Everyone is panic buying pop culture. Like they suddenly are paying attention to skateboarding again. They suddenly, every record label, I've had countless people reach out about XL and even till people today about Endgame or anything to do a Comeback Kick. So like, oh my God, we need a punk and hardcore band suddenly. And so for me, punk and hardcore was like this amazing world to grow up in and be a part of and go to those shows. But also, you know, I love a lot of pop music. I love indie. I was seeing, you know, Taking Back Sundays. And I think for me, it was seeing, again, I do this for the artist. So, you know, that's something that I love to do. Maybe I'm too people pleasing at times, but I think that can only be a good thing. But, you know, seeing their reaction, you know, again, to take back to Comeback Kid was they played Underworld. The first time I worked with them this was 2012, 2013. They played Underworld and they were in our second ever issue of the magazine. And I remember handing it to Andrew and Stu and they were like, this is so cool. This is like, you know, this is what we do in comparison to like, oh, just throw us this album link. So for me, something tangible and tangibility is a big thing. You know, I grew up in a household where we were always putting on CDs or there was vinyl or, you know, we collected things or, you know, my parents were into antiques. So for me, that being tangible was great and kind of like instilling that. And I remember just thinking, you know, I never thought Discovered would even become a possible career thing. For me, it was like, I loved passing my time doing it. I still see it as this hobby that, as I said, has kind of gone too far. So for me, like entering music at that time, I think I still had that young perception and love and passion for it that maybe I was a little blind to, like, you know, print was collapsing or we were moving away from CD into the digital world and stuff like this. And I think, again, I was happy I got into it young because I think had I got into it even just a couple of years later when I was 18, I would have had that cynical realism about it, like, nah, this could never take off. So I think, again, it's that most days when we get a cover that I like love or I take a portrait that I love, that 15-year-old me is just there going like, woo! Like,
I what you just said is so important because, like, okay, if you're in a band, you know, it's like, it makes sense. Like, you know, it's like, I'm going to get on stage. Like, you know, someone, even if we suck, someone in that room is going to tell us we're their favorite band or like whatever it is. Like with bands, there's that like instant feedback loop where getting up on stage has its own high, its own charge and all of that. But then there are the people that are part of the whole infrastructure of music, like labels, booking agents, managers, like, you know, press, all of those kinds of things. And there was this one point where it's like, oh, like if you're getting into music, you've got like a death wish. Like, why are you doing that? Because that whole industry is dying. And that's when you were around that era is when you were charging headfirst into it. How much of it was youth? How much of it was you being able to see the opportunity? And how much of it was just like, this is my passion, no matter what, I'm going to do it?
I think what it was is, like I said, I remember there was a really important time that I remember, and this is when I was like, oh my God, I should be doing this now. And it was when the first credit crunch happened, you know, when the banking sort of early 2000 crisis. And so I was only in school, like I wasn't even thinking about a career at this point. And I remember watching my dad take his consultancy stuff, he sat down with his CV. I always remember this, walked into the kitchen, it was him and my stepmom, and he was like going through and he was highlighting these transferable skills. And he started joking about when he'd go to shows and he'd see this. And he was like, actually, I could write this down as a transferable skill. And I remember being like, you know, it's one of these memories that for some reason of all the things I've done in my life really sticks with me, and being like, he was such a go-getter when all of that was happening. And my mum as well, you know, she went to university, ended up in childcare, and then eventually, but years later, she became a fully qualified nurse just through like working constantly and studying constantly. And like, again, it was like I grew up in a household with that around me, that even though ultimately the position my mother ended up working in the hospital and specialist that she was in orthopedics, people had gone to university and are still in university to train for that. But she was like, okay, I'm going to go do my job, provide for my kids, and then I'm going to sit there and studying. And like, you know, I'd see her ring binders lying around of like her studying. So for me, it was like, if something is easy, it's not worth going after. And I think that's still my ethos now, that because there are days where it is a challenging job and it's like, I'm like, yeah, I should get a full-time corporate job and start working in music full stop. But I'm like, and I've tried that. I've tried living in and doing some corporate jobs, you know, just to make the money when you finish uni and stuff. And I get like a week in and I'm like, this cannot be the rest of my life. Surely not. So I think it's almost a survival mode that's always kept me going with this. Like, okay, I've got to pay these bills. I've got to pay my mortgage. I've got to do this. Like, I've got to do these adult things. I've got to make it work. And then I think that's where it gets like, it's, you know, if you don't mind repeating the question, so like percentage rise, like it is the youthful thing, like the youthful love of music never ever goes away. Never ever. Like I could be sent a demo tomorrow and I will stop what I'm doing to put it on. I just thought it was my attention span, but apparently it's my youthful love of music. So I'll do that, and then, you know, that keeps me going all the time, and then it's the passion. But like, again, I think I was very lucky to have the parents that I had where, you know, never gave me a penny towards Discovered, anything like that, you know, which again, I grew up in a neighborhood where kids' parents were doing that. Like, I want to start a garage. Their dad would buy them a garage, stuff like this. Like, my parents were like complete opposite. And it was like a childhood full of like knowledge and constantly be encouraged to like learn. So like every other weekend going to museums and stuff like this. And, you know, one thing that I don't think you mentioned, but a big percent of what keeps me going, whether it's I accidentally open up, you know, download Premiere Pro and next thing you know, I'm editing a whole music video, is curiosity. You know, I sit and watch a tutorial for like 2 seconds because of my attention span. I'm like, oh, what does that button do? Oh, what does this do? And it's how I fell into photography and learning how to put a magazine together. And, you know, even when we started printing the magazine at first, I remember our printing house was so taken back. So I was like, hey, can I come down and visit and watch you put a magazine together? And when I go to watch it run through those machines and like down, you know, having conversations, you know, I know the name Daryl of the guy that ships every single magazine out. You know, he just pushes crates of magazines around. So I was like, right, I'm going to go make friends with everyone at every given stage, whether it's Gary putting the plates together or Rob, who's the account manager for our account. And like, you know, it was that curiosity. What do they do? Like, what kind of people are they? So I think that's always, that's been one of the biggest factors that keeps me going in all of this.
So a lot of people want a career in the arts, whatever it is, right? Like whatever their desire is. But there's some limiting factors for people that often get them to wash out. So one of them is like money, right? Like the dependability of it. The second is getting access to like the people or the movements that you want to be a part of. And the last is like the small world is highly competitive. Like it can be a little bit toxic. Like how have you kept going? Because you've just kept going and making more and more of a name for yourself. And actually in the past 2 years, it really seems like you've really established the magazine. You've really established yourself as an artist manager. Like you're kind of in a new place in your career, but that must have come with a lot of like, how have you kept motivating yourself and pushing yourself?
The irony of, you know, I didn't think this now until you said about that being within the last 2 years, right? It's pre-pandemic. The pandemic is about to start. No one knows it's coming. And I'm over in LA. So I was over in New York even. And I was at Roadrunner that was about to sign Dana Dentata. And this was impactful because she is a whole different bag to what Roadrunner normally signs. And I was sat there, it was me. And again, I got my foot through the door because I'd helped out Backtrack. And then Ricky Singh was at Roadrunner. So he was like, hey, you've helped Backtrack out. Come to this meeting. I'll get you talking to this guy. Again, I shouldn't have probably talked about the Americans because the UK people were like, you know, come talk to us first. But again, they're also really supportive. And I think what it was is like, you know, I sat down and I was ready to start a whole new magazine that touched down on all these cultural things because I'd seen the magazines that I love when they started to talk about fashion or they started to talk about skateboarding. There was such a like, what on earth are you doing? That I was like, surely this can't be done in a genuine way. So I was like, I'm going to start this entirely new magazine. It was going to be called New School. I took it to all these people. They were like, this is awesome. But what it was is I walked into that Roadrunner meeting and I was expecting, oh, you know, this is a big label, right? I was expecting, he's worked with every magazine in the world. So, you know, and he sits down, the head of the label, I can't remember his name for the life of me. I think David or something like this. So he's at his desk. He's got the traditional desk and the plaque of like CEO or whatever. He's got all these gold discs of your Corns and your Slipknots and stuff. And the first thing he has on his desk and I spot when I walked in was the Turnstile issue of Discovered that we did. And the minute I opened my mouth to start talking about this new idea with him, I regretted it instantly because every question he was firing off at me what's next for Discovered? Where do we go from here? What's going on? So I come home. Even prior to that, basically I'd gone out to New York with Harley that works for me at the time, to go shoot Code Orange for a cover story. We get to Pittsburgh as the pandemic closes in. So it's like we have no cover story. And I'm like, what do I do? And I get a tip off through, again, it's like people that I'd helped in hardcore. I'd like put it up and I was like, I literally made a joke on Instagram. I was like, who wants to be on the cover? And I get a tip off of Rotting Out's playing this illegal show. Illegal, like it basically wasn't a show that was meant to go ahead at the time. They're playing this show in Skid Row. Do you want to come down? I remember getting to LA, so like caught a flight into LA because it wasn't so hectic COVID-wise. And this is the story that over the last 2 years has really pushed Discover to where it was. And I remember I get there and meet up with Walter and we're shooting these portraits. And this is in an area that our Uber driver was like, I don't want to drop you off here with your camera gear. Like you should go a couple of streets down. And I was like, look, if I get mugged, I guess at least I tried to get these cool shots or whatever. Like I'm one of those people of like, oh, well, if it's happened, it's happened. So shot that cover, and then the pandemic kicks in in the UK, right? We get past those first 2 weeks of we have to isolate, and it goes, I was like, damn, we're giving away for free. What do we do? And so I remember we just dropped this cover, and at the time, I to tie it back to Sam Siegler the year prior, he was like, hey, we're doing up Rev. I showed him the magazine, so I was interviewing him about Youth of Today and a couple of bits, and he was like, you should come partner with us and work with us. And, I've had some amazing conversations with him since, but again, he was like, we're breaking this new band called Drain. So I was like, great, they're a brand new band. This could be the issue that like sinks us because no one's going to buy it because of the pandemic. We should do something incredible. So as you know, there was the Blast poster that came out with them being skated over the top. And Andrew Cannon, who does Santa Cruz, reached out and was like, I've got this shot of Drain with Henry Gartland skating over the top of them. So I was like, okay, the connection here, I love connecting things. It's the way my brain works. I was like, Rotting Out's California, Drain is California. Let's sandwich these both on a cover and release it. If the pandemic means we never do it, at least we went out on a bang. These are both really cool cover stories. And people went wild for it. I remember I get back to the UK, so I've got jet lag, supermarkets are empty, I'm in a pandemic, trying to run a business in music that is ultimately crashing. And I was like, I have to do something to keep sane. So I was constantly like creating content or asking people about their interests. For example, Jesus Piece being on the cover in the pandemic, no album out, no relevance really in terms of anything new, which normally a PR is like interview my band when they're sort of like in rotation, they call it, right? And with Aram, we spoke about like the skateboarding element, like the Hare Krishna stuff with Louise and stuff like that. So for me, that was the driving point of like, okay, this stuff can exist within Discovered. These countercultures can, because of the genres of music we come to, celebrate this stuff. Let's keep going. And like every time now, like, I'm seeing other magazines that years ago that I pitched, Trapped Under Ice, for example, that we'd never cover that. I'm now seeing them putting like the veins on the cover and stuff like this. And yeah, like you said, that ties into the competitive thing. And I've had my moments of like, why are they doing that? Oh no. But I was like, okay, well, let's just find a different angle. And it's definitely in the last few years. And again, I guess from the pandemic, everyone had a lot of downtime. It's like I got back into skateboarding and watching skate edits. And, I'm a sole believer that the magazine is where it is now because of the people that are around it. So, like Spencer with him doing Endgame is always encouraging, and surrounding myself with positive people that see the magazine for what it is and not as a competitor to other magazines has been like the biggest thing for keeping it going and keeping me going for sure.
Yeah. Do you mind if I speak on that, surrounding yourself with the right people?
Yeah, go for it.
It's the number one thing that I think something I often say to people is like, don't go out and find people. The right people are going to find you. Your job is to recognize them and get rid of the people in your life who are toxic and shitty. And it doesn't mean they're bad people. Like, when we call people toxic, it's like, oh, they're toxic. No, like, you just got people who you've got people who maybe fit your life or what you're about at a certain point. But at some point you got to realize, like, if you're surrounded by people who are criticizing you, either to you or about you, those aren't people who, they aren't right for you. It doesn't mean they're bad people, but they're not right for you. If you're in a friend group that's like really critical of each other and shitty, they're not bad people. You got to find the right people. And very often you actually have them there. They're already in front of you. You just haven't invested in them. And investing in the right people is like, I think the most important thing you can do as a person, especially as a business person. Like having a business and surrounding yourself with the right people, and not just surrounding yourself, but investing in them, spending time with them, like building those relationships, deepening them, because those are the people that are going to inspire you, energize you, lift you back up, give you the hard talking to that you might need. You're bringing names up that are part of the story that I think are important. Sam is like a good person, like, you know, like really supportive, like always wants to create connections. And it's that kind of idea that like you can bring out the best in yourself, you can bring out the best in bands, but you can bring out the best in our community. Because this punk and hardcore and metal thing, like, it's so cool in a lot of ways. It's so, first of all, it's so cool, but it's also like got horrible, terrible elements to it that we all kind of skirt. And you definitely seem to be someone who's like not afraid to confront those a little bit and set a different standard, which is actually what I want to talk about next. But anything you want to say about what I just said there?
Yeah. You know what? It's a weird one because honestly, recently, like I said, I've been working a lot with Comeback Kid on their album campaign, and something Andrew and I was talking about on a drive one night coming back from Boston. It was the end of the tour, and you know, I caught him saying some really great things about myself to the One Step guys, and I was like, that's so cool that he was doing that, you know, and like we ended up having this discussion about. Especially because, you know, you have a pandemic, suddenly all the people that were once your mates, they want a guest list for something disappear, and all of those underground people. And I think we were saying you're like, you know, you are the sum of the 10 people that you surround yourself with. So, you know, throughout the pandemic, Sam Siegler kept me sane by saying, hey, work on this Rev project with me. Hey, we should do this, we should do that. And, you know, even when we pivoted the magazine into selling vinyl, he was like, let's do it. And I think what it is when I look at that guy and you look at the photos of him when he was in these bands, he was a 15-year-old kid with that passion for it. So I see a lot of like myself in becoming the sort of person that he is. And so that's someone, again, that's very important to me in the sense of like, you know, I reach out to them whether I've got a query about music stuff. But again, people like Andrew, like the reason I was drawn to working with them, you know, the irony is pre-ever meeting those guys, they were the first live band I ever saw. Ever. I was in like 2007 or 6 or something like this with Terror and stuff. And I was like, oh, I love this band. I love like that Symptoms and Cures record. My older brother was into it, so I got into it. And then once I met Andrew as a person and seeing sort of like how he handles the people around him. And like, you know, he's one of these people that I'll be like, oh, I'm in Portugal. And he's like, yeah, go talk to this tattoo artist. This band is sick. This is it. And that's something that I've seen. And like you said, I've nourished that friendship as well. And like those sorts of people around me. And again, like the Ricky Sings of the world, where they're like, you know, it's funny because he you know, he's in the Concord Music and the major label world, but you know, he's got his label with Flat Spot and those good people. So for me, I'm kind of getting a little off topic here. It's like, yeah, to add on what you're saying with hardcore, it's like, yeah, unfortunately, there is some stuff that I don't agree with, and I don't want to delve in it too much because I don't want to put my foot in my mouth in any way. But I think it's like you said, it ultimately, whether you're part of any community, so I've got friends that are religious, you know, they're church groups. There's going to be people in their church groups that have some very backward views, but then there's some great people they found through that and stuff like this, or like any kind of community, like, you know, my older brother's a graphic designer and an artist and other artists, you know, there's a million people in the art world, but he finds the right people. So I think that's definitely been something that I've been like overtly a bad judge of character and be like, yeah, everyone's great, and learn the hard way on those sorts of situations. Definitely, for sure. That's a big part of my story, but like, it's got to a point now where I'm genuinely happy about it. So like, I think even Spencer would say this with Endgame. It's like, even approaching before managing them, you know, we all got on a conversation and I was like, you know, if I vibe with someone and it, you know, for me, I'm a firm believer in like, just be nice to everyone. It doesn't cost anything to be nice, but you know, any new band asks me, you know, how do I get further in this career? It's like, be a decent person, you know, go up and be nice to that label guy over there, or be nice to that person there. Because I think it comes down to that thing. I hate that saying, you know, it's all about who you know. It's not. It's all about who you leave a good impression with. You know, and again, I think that sums up what my views are and what you were saying is, yeah, there's all this terrible stuff. But I feel like the people that maybe have those negative attitudes, they're the ones that never get past the glass ceiling that sometimes is associated with these genres of music.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think there's a lot of like really shitty people that get pretty far ahead in punk and hardcore, but that's because they're held up by really decent people. Not just in punk and hardcore, but in the business world, in the world, there are a ton of like horrible, shitty people that become successful. And it's because they're supported and boosted up by good people. But that doesn't mean that those good people are wrong. And it doesn't actually mean that system's broken. It's just kind of like how society works. What I think is interesting, though, is how we can like, okay, we know that's a reality. How do we actually then start focusing, not trying to break that down, but instead focus on, well, like, let's just boost up more good people. Like, let's counter that by focusing on people who are like positive or have something good to say, or maybe even they're not necessarily positive, but like their art or their ideas or what they're doing is important, and it brings something new to the conversation. I also want to, you mentioned Ricky, who is a wonderful person, and Ricky, thank you for all you do. I love Flat Spot, and I think you're a great guy. All right, let's talk about what's something in the industry that you're trying to lead by example to change.
Do you know, somebody was saying this the other day, actually. I think it was just on LinkedIn about some streaming platform. And they were like, I've created this platform that allows an artist, no matter how many streams they have, to find a way of income. Or someone like this guy called Ackle Dillon's doing it with the music federation that he's doing. And it's like, it's something that I found over the years, and this is again from working on an introducing desk through to pitching when I was a freelancer, through to like even mates bands. And I'd be like, you're so good. Why are you not in XYZ magazine? And it was like this mindset of they have to, I already have to be signed to get in there, because advertisement talks when you have a major publisher behind your magazine, right? I've never had a major publisher behind me. At one point I wanted that because I was like, gosh, I'd like to make this my real job. But it's like, I don't want to put myself in the flip. So I think, like you said, the right people gravitate towards you. And it's like, one thing I try to do if I'm at a show and there's a new band opening and they're really great is try to find a way to have a conversation. I don't want to go over there all industry like, I do this and we should work together. I'm like, hey, how you doing? Like, vibe with them as a bit as a person. I'm like, okay, cool. Like, you know, have you got an email for your band? Who's your PR? A lot of the time they're at that level where they don't have one, and I'll drop them an email and say, hey, I didn't want to be that person at the show, but this is what I do. This is the magazine's platform. Like, what are your plans? What have you got coming up? And then working directly with them. So that's something that I try to lead by example with is on that. One person in particular I'd love to mention, because she got me into actually doing podcasting, was Tana Herman. So she was, you know, she now does Parkway and, you know, Comeback Kids First tour manager. And I saw an article years ago. Again, this is pre me even working with them. She was in Alternative Press, and they were like, all set up like a desk, like one of them was bent over and a laptop was on them and stuff. And like, it's burnt into my memory. And it was like, I was like, oh, first of all, representation. All of these magazines I'm picking up, it's like, you know, admittedly cis white guy over and over again. At the time, you know, I'm listening to the music, not thinking into it. And I just see this woman and I was like, that's so cool. What does she do? Like, and looked into that. So when I had the chance to work with her on For the Children, or with like Evil Greed's stuff for like, you know, celebrating like women in music, I was like, yeah, cool, let's go for it. And I know it sounds bad, but like the feeling I get from that, and like that feeling of just like, oh, this is so awesome. Like, I was saying this to a band the other day, when you go out on stage, I was saying this about the Comeback Kid release recently. It's like when you go out on stage and you see someone and you get that feeling of kids like screaming back at you and loving that. That's the feeling I get when I'm like, that's so sick. I got them that free pair of Vans, or we did that music video premiere for them. Like that to me, and not by any means by any means a savior complex, but like that is such a great feeling that every time I think, yeah, we don't have the world's biggest readership numbers, we don't have the world's biggest billboard adverts out places, like I'm just like, well, do you know what? At least I can say I gave that band their first cover or their first interview. And, you know, again, wider out now, it's like, great, that guy, you know, during the pandemic, I had some downtime. I went to Huntington Beach because Sam recommended it, and I was watching a bunch of great people skate. And this guy, he was so good. He was so good. Like, you know, I was just mind blown. And, you know, I approached him afterwards, this guy called Terry, and I was like, hey, I'd love to do something on about you and your skateboarding. I was like, I'm not Huck. I'm not Thrasher. I'm not these. I'm a music mag, but we love skateboarding. And then we did a feature on the guy. And like, I think, again, it goes back to that sentiment of we've not got a major publisher hanging over our shoulders saying, you need to sell this many magazines. You need to sell this much advertisement. Therefore, you need to change the number on that review, which, by the way, I've seen happen. You need to interview these massive bands that are happening right now. It's kind of having that punk spirit to it of like, I want to cover what admittedly like I like musically and I find interesting. And in more recent years, in those 2 years, is having those discussions with people of like, hey, you should check out my mate's band and help them out. Or, you know, there's this really cool skateboarder I've worked with and going for that. So again, I think the entirety of Discovered's ethos is built on, like you said, is sometimes it sucks because we have lifted bands that by the time it's gone to print, there's an allegation about them and it's like, oh, fuck. Like, and people don't understand that there's a week window where it's like, I send it to the printers, I can't change anything for a week. So if they happen to be on the cover or we've done an interview with them, I'm too small of a business to ring my printers, tell them to pulp every single magazine that we've put out, and destroy it in that time. So like, yeah, it does suck because our intention was to go in there and help them because we thought they were good people. And then there's that window of time, like I said, where we have no control. And then the magazine drops. I mean, there was a period of time, admittedly, when there was just allegation after allegation related to these kind of musicians that I would panic about every time I put a magazine to print. I was like, please, can every human being in this magazine be decent? Because I don't want to be associated with these kind of things that they're getting up to. And then fortunately, like, other than one occasion, it's never happened. We've been lucky. But again, it's like, it's very much that is, again, some people see things very black and white. Like I said, there's some awful people that I think we could both probably list at some point, which I'm not going to because that's not really within my ethos. But like, and you go, oh, why are you working with that nice person? You turn to your mate who's a really nice person in the industry and you're like, why are you working with that person? And then, do you know what? It's not very black and white. There's a lot of politics. Sometimes contracts involved with record deals and stuff like this. So,
and it touches on something. I think it's like, I don't want to have bullshitty conversations with anyone about anything. And like one of the things, like, when you grow up in punk and hardcore, you're like, the corporate world is so evil. Like, and I mean, that's me. Like, I was like, corporate world is so evil. And then I started working and I'm like, oh, the corporate world is like literally exactly the same as the punk world in many ways from the human interactions and how things happen. And then like, even like the really good impact of some companies that are obvious, and then also the really good impact of some companies that's not obvious. It's kind of like not hidden, but it's just like obscured or not obvious. And then like the really, really bad stuff that's obvious that you see and you hear about, and then the really bad stuff that nobody talks about. It's like human beings are human beings. You put them in like an artistic discipline, you put them in a corporation, you put them in all sorts of different situations. Super cool stuff's going to happen. And sometimes people who are doing cool things are also doing terrible things. Super bad stuff's going to happen. Sometimes the people who are doing terrible stuff are going to do cool things. And there's the whole mix in between. I don't like the idea that like when I talk about like talking about business versus art, or like, because art has business in it, that there's like good and bad. And you hit on a word that I think is important. It's just like, there's just a ton of nuances, and people can be like shitty in one way and amazing in another. And there's all sorts of lines that people can cross where it's like, okay, well, that's too far. And now you got to go. But I really operate more from a mindset of I don't think people are like good or bad. I think that people are largely neutral, and they take on the values and they take on to the approach of the environment they're in and the people that they're with. And people have like core values, but core values can be impacted if you're in a really shitty, toxic environment for a long time. Your core values can be eroded.
Yeah.
And so when I think of stuff like punk and hardcore, I think it's so aspirational in a good way. Like I think of youth of today, it's like, God damn, like I aspire to live like that. And some days I do it well and other days I don't. I'm like a little like shitty, like asshole. I'm like grumpy and throwing little baby fits. But like, I like what you said about nuances, and like shit is just complex. Like there's a lot of complexity, but it brings us to something that I really am super interested in getting your take on. And you'd said it before we actually started recording, which is like, listen, punk, hardcore, and business, they can exist together. And in fact, they can exist together in like a pretty cool and ethical way. You just got to be able to like do it. And so much of what I'm hearing about Discovered is like, you know what? Because you're not backed by some big company, you can just go and do a feature on a skateboarder. Or because you just like some band from Calgary, Alberta, you can just go and decide to manage them. Like that's a really cool thing, but that's a really hard thing to do in a successful business. So what are your thoughts on that? Like how do you actually follow your passion and also make that a business?
I think where we got lucky is that we came around at the time in the market let's talk business for a minute. In fact, I have been looking forward to talking to business with somebody that's from my world for a very long time. Let's go back to 2012. We came about and I was seeing bands like Architects start to reach that potential, or Your Demise, our second ever cover, was selling out shows. And so I was like, these bands are shifting a bunch of... Your Demise in particular, every single human being I knew had one of their t-shirts. And I was like, well, no one's put them on a magazine cover. I think a lot of the time I like to think that my business sense is led by logic, and it's stuff like that. So it's like... And it was the same with like, when we deal with an advertiser. I won't go into it too much because it's kind of our secret ingredient, but I'll be like, well, why don't we run a bunch of content as well? Like the outcome of whatever you pay for an advert, that's why we don't do reviews, isn't going to change whether we do a review or not on you. It's just like... if I'm flicking through a magazine and I see an advert for like a Slipknot record and then I don't read into it, that advert's not going to stay in my mind. So for me, it's like I love being creative. I love finding solutions. But then, again, I did music industry management. I really lent in on the business. And for me, it's like those two things. It's interesting to kind of go back to what you're saying when people are like, oh, they can exist. They already exist. We physically hold the vinyl of the bands that we love. We go and see them at the festivals. We go and see them at the shows. So when you turn around and have this mindset of like the business world and the music world can't exist, it already does. That you wouldn't be sat there with a pair of headphones on if it didn't exist. I wouldn't have heard Endgame through Instagram had I not set up a business account on there. You know what I mean? So like, this is what I mean by they're so fundamentally tied together, but it does lead to something that I'm also currently do for a living. So I help get brand partnerships between like the Dickies of the world and like a couple of other brands, like, for example, Santa Cruz and One Step Closer, right? If I didn't think Santa Cruz were a genuine skate brand or One Step Closer weren't a genuine band, I wouldn't have dared team them up together. So I think like that's the sort of thing where as a business, I was like, that makes sense because we want to launch and get our foot in the world of skateboarding with integrity. We don't want to alienate the music crowd. I was watching One Step Closer like grow and grow as a band, but these little personalities coming together with different interests. So I was like, oh, you have those like, I have a lot of light bulb moments of like, oh, that person and that person, oh, I should connect them. Essentially like the same way that, again, someone like Sam Siegler, you couldn't really ask them to narrow down what their job title is because, he was like, hey, come work on this project with Rev with me. Or, the vinyl thing was a big thing for us. I got to the point where we would like be publishing 100 articles a month online, like probably a lot more than that because of the size of our team. And you'd have the email, every other email was like, can you include a link to the album? And I was like, okay, that's where it started to touch a nerve, a bit of corporation thing. I was like, I wrote this article and interviewed this band because they had something great to say, not because at the end I'm like, please go buy this album. And then I was like, do you know what? Maybe I can apply that in a smart way. Why don't we keep it so that rather than send, again, business sense here, send them off to a record store, the corporate record stores to buy that record, hence us also doing variants. Why don't we also make a copy of the record? Why don't we also sell the vinyl? So it's kind of applying that again, that survival instinct of like, it has to make money to keep going. And sometimes I've had some very heavy debates about that where people are like, oh my God, you shouldn't be making money as a magazine. It's like, well, how do we afford to print it and then get it out in front of you? Oh, I didn't think of that. There's a lot of like, logic that sometimes can lack in that argument because like you said, punk comes from this place of anarchy and anti-corporation and stuff like this. But then it's also, if you start to say that you can't be in business in punk, what are you saying to all the independent punk record stores? What are you saying to the Indecision Records and the Triple Bs? Are you going to tell Sam to stop making records? No, he's not. He's going to be like, yeah, that's cool, but I have a mortgage over here I've got to pay for, or whatever his setup is, He's not going to be like, oh, you're right, I shouldn't be selling vinyl.
So I'm dating myself here pretty hard, but I remember when No Warning was like, I think the first band that started selling their 7-inch for like a proper amount of money. I can't remember. It was their first 7-inch they put out. And like on the Rev board, people are like, oh my God, I can't believe No Warning is selling their 7-inch for whatever amount of money on tour. And I was like, of two minds, like me being a college student at the time and a cheap bastard. I was like, I want a 7-inch for $3. But I was like, fuck, I mean, I know how much it takes to put out a 7-inch because I had started putting out records at that time.
Yeah.
And like that, I love the aspirational side of punk and hardcore. And I never want that to go, that aspiring to be something. And then I also like that as the scene has kind of matured a lot and there's more and more like older people or people who are like a more like business acumen involved in it, where it's like the kind of maturation of how people engage from a business perspective. Like I think Discovered is a really cool example. Like you're an actual business and you're doing actual things, but you're doing it in a cool way and reputationally strong. You're figuring out there's a creativity to it. And it harkens back to Discord. Like I think of like Discord and a lot of the record labels of kind of like those first waves of punk and hardcore where they figured it out and they did it. And then Revelation Records is another example of it. Like it can be done but you got to have the business conversations, and having proper business conversations is actually a healthy thing. It's like, well, yeah, let's just have the discussion. But if we go in with like an undermining, like, this is unethical, that's wrong, this is wrong, it's like, well, we're not having a discussion right now. One of us is just posturing. Let's have a real discussion, and we'll figure out the best way to do it that applies to our ethics, that represents our community. But you got to have the conversation. And I think Discover's been really cool about that, because it's just like what you do and how you do it is like very, very obvious. And I think it's like really, you're setting a very good example.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I think to go on that merit though, it is that thing, like you said, I used to think that those conversations could be uncomfortable, but then I was like, again, the survival thing. So for example, the first time we ever got paid advertisement in the magazine was having to go to it was Roadrunner, and Roadrunner and Pure Noise and a couple of other labels like Rev have always been really big supporters with us, with not just like the AdSense, but like also teaming with us. So I'll get the odd email now from Jake, or like he'll be like, hey, why don't we also do this? And then also here's an advert. And even with that, I have to be honest with them and say, hey, ultimately I can't drop the rate any lower. I'm happy to do a good rate for you guys, but I need to afford to print or pay the cover story journalist or the photo shoot from the cover. So it's having that, but being honest and just saying like, this isn't just for us to be this big corporate company. It's like, and I've said that to even a couple of sponsorships we've got recently. It's like, okay, we need to grow realistically. Boom, here's the figure. I'm not going to be mad if it turns out to just be something really cool. But you've also got to have it on the flip as well. I've had people say, come and sponsor our festival. Come and sponsor our festival. In fact, we've sponsored festivals. This has happened in the past, and I won't name names, from the punk and hardcore world. We've sponsored them. We've given them thousands of pounds worth of advertisement for free, and we get to the festival and our name's nowhere to be seen. And that's where I'm like, they're the punk guys putting on a punk festival, but we're the bad guys because we're a business. We've just been screwed here. How are we the bad guys? And I think there's been a lot of those situations where it's like, we've been screwed by the other way around. Not saying that we're like, it's the corporate world screwed by anything. I don't even call Discovered corporate in any way, because yeah, we have business values and business sense, but our ethos isn't like, I'm going to go send Discovered into space in 25 years. I'd love that level of success, but it's not where my brain is at. I was saying this to the guy called Adam Hopkins, been a very long time friend and journalist of the magazine, and we were talking about the Big 10-year thing. And again, I was joking, this has gone too far, but I was like, I don't want to be Elon Musk tomorrow with this. That's just, it scares me. I honestly think that it would get to a point where the mag, I always make a joke to some of my closest friends, hey, the mag blows up tomorrow, boom, it's yours, you have it, I'm done. It's like when a band gets too big, like when Nirvana did, Reading or some of these others, or Jawbreaker, and they're like, nah, probably shouldn't take this any further, not saying it's going to happen anytime soon. It'd have to get really far to do that, but like I said, we don't have the Richard Branson expression. And what's weird is I've met people along the way, when I was 16 and doing when Discovered first kicked off 2012, I don't want to say a friend of my dad's, but one of his colleagues or whatever. I went to see my dad at work, this guy called Gary, and I remember him, he was so he's one of these super businessy people, when you're just I don't get a good vibe from this guy, and he was like, go to Richard Branson, show him your magazine, do this. I was like, Richard Branson made a career off I just don't agree with that guy's ethics. And I was like, yeah, that could be a quick thing of hey, I have a music magazine, I'm a young entrepreneur, you support these people, but hell no do I want to get involved with that. I was like, I'd rather slog away and be fulfilled every single month. We're 85 issues in now. Every single time I hold one of those in my hands, it is the best feeling. I look at it and I'm like, oh wow, this is a tangible thing in comparison to oh, here's my bank balance for this month,
Yeah, and also if you do it the right way and you're lucky and you stick to it, you can have both. You can have a cool creative output, and you can also make a decent.
And my space adventure,
Yeah, well, why not? Why not?
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into some nitty gritty though. When we think of from a business perspective, what does it mean for artist management? For example, very specifically, because you've talked about this a little bit. What does it mean to defend an artist?
So, I'll give you an example. The artists that I'm managing now, XL Life, they were reaching an absolute plateau of a career, a momentous career in their past career, signing to Sony, doing stuff like this. And when I first started talking to Phil again about his band and this new band and why he's doing that and not continuing the other, all of it seemed to be once they got themselves in a position where a label was like, no, you can't tour with this band, you have to go do this, you have to go do that. That's when some of the greatest artists in the world, when you look at their careers, they give up that. And I also hate that in every movie the industry guy is the bad guy. Like the Queen movie, I was like, oh my gosh, we're not all that bad. Like Freddie Mercury probably met one bad dude. Like, calm down. So for me to defend the artist, it comes down to this. It's like, it's being in their corner where it's making sure that they're getting what's deserved, but also not paying their ego. Because I've seen that imbalance go wrong, where people have kicked off, tour managers and such. My artist should get this on the rider. Why have I not got my bowl of green, M&Ms or whatever that famous story was? But there's also the flip to be like, hey, these people are coming along and playing this music for you. It's their talent that your whole business is dependent on, and like getting in there. So like, it's also that. It's also like, I think it's, I said this in the lead up to this interview to some of your colleagues. It's like, it's the caregiver in me that's like, making sure you're okay. I've had friends that are constantly, I've seen their like PR schedule be so rammed, they're having panic attacks. And I'm like, whoa, like we can do our cover story in like 4 weeks once you've had some time for yourself. So like, it's something, even to go down to the record thing that you were saying about hardcore kids with their records. Like, I had to reach out to someone the other day that was like, they ordered a record that's a pre-order, 24 hours later, where is my record? And I was like, do you know what? I'm not going to go in and just be like, finals delayed because of COVID. I was like, hey, you're talking to another human being on the flip side. Or it's like, I don't know where this came from, is like on social media recently, we put up a couple of posts with various bands, and there were some like horrible comments like, oh, this person's gotten ugly. Oh, I can tell which one's the chubby guy. And I was like, yo, like that's not acceptable. Like everyone's a human being. That musician's going to check on that post because they're like, oh, cool, someone's backing my band. What right do you have to tear them down? So like, it comes in that, like, there's a big humane part that, again, my parents instilled in me of, like, you can't treat people that way. And fortunately, I had parents that were always very vocal. Like I said, my mum would go to the Rock Against Racism gigs the Clash would do, so she saw that stuff. I mean, the hospital she worked in, all of her ward was, she worked with a lot of Filipino people, and like, so she would see firsthand when stuff would happen to them and was like, right, I'm going to talk out about this. And it's the same with my dad, with his colleagues, and, traveling the world a lot when I was younger with my dad, lived in Costa Rica and went to these different places and stuff with him. And so, it's even on the flip. Then I went back to Costa Rica recently and was hanging out with like friends that I grew up and spent time with, and other people that I'd known through the punk and hardcore scene there. And it's like, there was that knock-on realization, because I went from Costa Rica, which is, it's a third world country, and seeing how much they appreciate that one gig that happened 10 years ago, to suddenly being on an East Coast tour where it's like every single night, people in the audience, not saying, it's great they're there to support the band, but they're like, yeah, next week I'll see Incendiary, or next week I'll see this band. So like, it is having that wider perspective of just being like, when it comes to the musicians, I'm very lucky that my best friend in the world is a musician, and the people around me are musicians a lot of the time. So I think it's seeing them as human beings. And I think that's something that happened very early on in my career, because the bands we were supporting in the beginning, there was no middleman. There was no industry person of, your interview is at this time. It was having an engagement with them. It was hanging out with them at their shows and stuff like that as well. So I think it boils down to the sentiment of like, we're all human beings. And I've never been a fan of like the big guy pushing someone around. And yeah, sometimes you have to go back to the band and be like, especially in management, and be like, no, your label guy isn't evil. This strategy makes sense. Or no, because they didn't book you on their festival this year and they're booking you next year, doesn't mean they're a bad guy. It's just their festival's full. And it goes back to that thing of like, not everything's black and white. So yeah, it's basically being like a parent, the inner parent,
It's like, what you're saying is resonating with me so much. So like, I love what you said. It's like in the movie, it's the music, like the industry person's always like the bad person, because it's totally true. But so having played in a bunch of bands, and then also having ran a record label before, like I've kind of been on both sides of the argument, where I was like, oh, record labels, like they're screwing you. It's like, listen, they're probably not really screwing you. Or if they are, it's like for like tens of dollars, not tens of thousands of dollars. Like understand the scope of what's going on in your life. And most things are probably not intentional. It's just some person who started a business as a kid and it spiraled out of their control. And it doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's right, but it's not terrible. But I've also been the record label where people are like, you're ripping us off. It's like, oh my God. Like, not only am I not ripping you off, like I can actually make a bed out of the records that are unsold by your shitty band that I'm going to now sleep on for the rest of my life. I've just spent like $7,000 on your band that I'm never going to get back. And so like, and also there's been times where I'm like, actually, you know what? I did screw up and you're right. And good for calling me out. And there's not a right or wrong. So you got that in the punk and the hardcore, or sorry, there's not like a black and white thing to it, but you've got that in punk and hardcore. That plays out in like kind of the traditional business world where people are like, my boss screwed me. It's like, actually, you were like an asshole and you're lazy and you didn't do your job, or you did it, but you were like talking shit the whole time, or someone's boss is an asshole. And it's like, I see so much of what plays out in like the band label perspective play out in just like normal people's jobs. And all it tells me is like, anybody can criticize either way. Like if you're a music industry person or you're a band, you're going to have a natural conflict, and you can choose to like take things personally and be like, that person's an asshole, or you can choose to become inquisitive, try and figure it out, like look at yourself, like you really consider like, what was my process here? And I loved what you said about the festivals very specifically. It's like, they're not supporting our band. Well, they can't put 9,000 bands on there. They can put 30 bands on there. Why are you acting like they've got it out for you? Which also sometimes they do have it out for you. So it's not like a one size fits all. And a lot of it has to do with like ego, social structure, what game you're playing. And you need someone in your corner to like fight for you, but also hold up a mirror. And that sounds like what you do.
Yeah, and honestly, it's what led me back into artist management. It was like hearing my mates' horror stories, and then I was interacting with some of these people at this festival, like without knowing, and I was like, I've just heard the horror story of like, and I was like, my brain was like, like, I always thought you were so on my level of like defending the band and working with it, and I've just heard what you did. And like, I never get involved in that drama, like I just do not live for that stuff, but I was like, oh, okay, this seems a bit weird. And I think the big moment came was, not to be dramatic, was in 2018, I was dealing with such a high level of stress from always trying to please people and be the good guy and do this. And, this constant fear of someone saying, oh, your business issues. But I had a straight up heart attack. I was watching Glassjaw, Brixton Academy. The date specifically is on the back of my neck, so I couldn't give you that. It was 2018. And I was watching it, and the floor at Brixton Academy is like, not everyone, this will be on Spotify, so people will hear it, but like the floor is like slanted forward. I remember the floor just feeling like it just being whipped back under my feet. I was having I thought it was undigested halloumi, to be totally fair with you. I was having like sweats, like my chest hurt. And I was leaving the venue, and I ran to a friend, and he was like, nah, don't go home, go to hospital. And I actually manage his band now as well. And I went, and they were like, you're having a heart attack. And I remember just being like, I was 23, I was having a heart attack. I was like, this surely cannot be happening. Fast forward a couple of months, and I was like, every doctor ever was like, stop working in music. Stop doing this. I tried for a week and was like, I will go more mad if I don't do this. But when people say to me, oh my gosh, there is the natural empathy. You had a heart attack. That's wild. Like, are you okay? That's fine. I move on from that. And I say it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. Like, even this morning, I was dealing with a high stress situation around some live stuff. And I was like, pre-heart attack me would be having a mad panic attack and would be super stressing and being straight on the phone with that person. Like, oh my gosh, let's resolve this now. Post heart attack me is like, is it worth your health? Is it worth adding additional stress? Is it worth ruining your day? Take a step back, go and talk to someone about it, write it down, journal, like get it out, revisit the conversation for when you're comfortable with it. I mean, I have an email that, Harley that used to work with me, but, still a very close friend of mine. She set this up for me in my emails. I have an email called Timeout. And when people are being very difficult on email, they get dropped into timeout and for like a 48-hour window, then I'll go back to them. Unless it's time sensitive, of course. But even like little tactics like that. So yeah, I think to go back, I think what you're originally saying is like to deal with it, it's like, there is this world of like, oh, there's this and this. But I think as well, when you look at the artists that have really succeeded, and I mean artists, I mean labels, I mean businesses, I was saying to someone yesterday, IKEA is the most punk rock thing in the world, right? Because they've just said, yeah, we like making furniture. Let's go about and make some furniture. I am yet to hear someone say, I know IKEA seems random, but to talk business for a minute, they're a bad company. They don't use 100% recyclable wood. They know what they are. And if they want to come out with some frug leg thing for your stove, they come out with it. You don't tear them down for it. In fact, I will happily quote now that IKEA is the most punk rock company in the world. because they've cut away that stress of like their competitors and stuff like this and gone for it. So I'd like to think when I think I've discovered that we have something for everyone and that we are the IKEA of culture magazines.
It's good. I like that. It's a good quote. So it sounds like, you take your mental health seriously though around this, because a lot of your job, it's all hands on, lots of personalities. You're constantly dealing with people. You're dealing with people's hopes, dreams, passions, egos, all that. Lots of blocking, lots of tackling. So how do you take care of yourself?
So it was only sort of in, I've had my down moments in a couple of years. I had quite a dramatic like entry into the adult world, if you will. Like my mother passed suddenly in the last year of uni, like literally suddenly, like a light switch. And then I was like left with like dealing with repatriating her body and then dealing with this and stuff. And I think what it was like very early on, I had to mature because I was going out into the adult world without that parent support behind me. I mean, granted, my dad was around, but like, it's a different relationship between, daughter and mother per se. So I was like left without that. So I was like, okay, I got to do this. And from the get-go, my mum's family, they'd all worked in like mental health nursing or had a family history of like mental health situations and dealing with those. So that was always really instilled in me. And it's the same with my dad. Like there are situations in my head where I'm like, it's so stressful. I'll get on the phone to him, explain it. And he's like, why are you stressing out? So there are multiple times where I'm like, what would my dad think of this situation? And he'd probably be like the most chill, like, this is stupid. Why are you getting mad over this? And I'd be like, yeah, let's not. So in terms of my mental health, I meditate every morning. I'm like what you said with you for today. I try to at least do that every day, depending on my time scale, or like, going for walks. Like, I know it sounds the traditional things. Even now, it's like knowing when to stop drinking coffee, when to hydrate. There was a period of time, unfortunately, working in music where I did dabble. And I'm going to hold my hands up actually, because there's a lot of stigma around this stuff. I dabbled in like the toxic substance stuff, and I'd always feel like crap the next day. And I was like, why does anyone do this? This isn't for me. So like falling out of play with that and realizing like, okay, that's not my outlet. What is my outlet for stress? And it also as well, it's like, this is only a very, very recent thing. Knowing when to remove myself from a conversation or a situation when it starts to get uncomfortable. Whether that's you're trying to get 5 guys in a van to leave in time to make their flight, and one of them keeps missing every time the other guy's back in the van. And I'm like, do you know what? If you miss your flight, that is now on you. And if they get in the van and want to debate that the time was different, not looking at anyone specifically and come back here, I'm like, do you know what? I'm not having this discussion with you. Like, it's having those situations and doing that. And I think, again, it comes down to like, I'd like to think I'm a big representation of my parents and their personalities. And for me, that is where as well, it's like kind of out the stress and learning a lot from them and what they do. And, outside of music, I love to paint. Even now, for example, something as stressful as running through a cover story. It's like if I'm staring at a screen, I'll be tempted to check social media. I print out like physical transcripts and enjoy reading through it and going through it that way. So like I think especially sort of like as younger business people like myself, it's not getting too involved with like what the digital world is. And sometimes someone will say something about the mag on Twitter or Instagram, and I go, what, do you know what? Hear them out. Is it a really valid point, or are they in a bad mood? Stuff like this. Okay, cool. That's not the real world. Take a step outside your front door. The fresh air hits you. That's real life. Like it's really leaning in on that balance for sure.
Yeah, I love what you just said about that. Like, so, when I started Cadence, it's not like people in the punk world know what I do, right? Like they kind of like, someone told me, it's like, oh, what are you, like Tony Robbins? And I was like, oh my God. Well, first of all, he's like a multimillionaire, so that's not that bad. But like, no, that's not even at all what I do. When I first started Cadence, I remember like really struggling with whether or not I do things like a podcast, or if I talk about punk and hardcore on my Instagram, or the business on the Instagram. And also like, I went through a really difficult period in 2016, and it really like clarified that like, I don't want to live my life fearing disapproval by people, and like fearing like what someone might say on Twitter or on Instagram, or someone doesn't think my band's cool or my business is cool or I'm cool. And I'd spent a lot of my life like being really afraid of that, especially the more kind of, I guess, like successful or more I'd kind of like developed a presence in punk and hardcore. I became very afraid of losing something rather than like kind of like just following who I am and my dreams and all this. I went through a very tough time in 2016, and on the tail end of that, I ended up starting Cadence, and it's been a hugely liberating thing because like paying too much attention to what other people think it's not bad. In fact, one of the things that I like to say is like, you've got to completely believe your own shit. You have to 100% believe the thing that you're putting your time into is absolutely worth it. You got to believe in yourself, believe in the people around you, believe your own shit, but be 0% afraid to be told that you're full of shit. But that doesn't mean some random tweet that you read is like, oh, this person's totally right. I'm going to take notes. Okay, you suck. Okay, guy, I've got it. Like,
frame it on the wall. Put it on the fridge.
Like, I'm totally willing to be told I'm full of shit, but I don't have 100% capacity to listen to every person who would say that. Instead, it's like anyone who's got strong background in what I'm doing, who kind of like knows what I'm doing, like whether it's in music or whether it's in business, if someone's got enough background and time like on the road themselves, like doing whatever I'm doing, and they're saying I'm full of shit, okay, tell me about it. I want to hear about that. I want to learn about it. It also means that maybe people who've been successful in things that I'm not involved in, or like people who've just been successful in general, if they're like, you're full of shit, I'm like, okay, well, you've been successful in other things. Tell me about it. Like the person who's giving you the random tweet, it's like, what have you done in your life? And it doesn't mean everyone has to do these big, huge things. But for me to like give you time to take what you're saying seriously, you better have a track record of doing some shit. And then if you do, I'm all in. Tell me. I want to learn. I want to get better. So much of what you do is done in the public eye. And it's funny because like, although you're doing all this stuff for bands, really like you're right in the center of it. And that really puts you in that blast zone. But it sounds like you found a way to like take care of yourself so that you can stay whole and bring your best self to the table.
Yeah, exactly. I always think about how lucky I am to do this. I mean, this last year, regardless of even a pandemic, I went all over South America and East Coast. And again, I'm very lucky that I get to work with my people, like some of my best friends doing what I do. And I'm like, not many people can do this. I think we've learned whether it's like, you know, even pre-pandemic, my mum suddenly passing like that. I'm like, bam, life can end just like that. You know, like I have no idea. Right now, my ceiling, hopefully not, because let's hope not, like could come in and that's it, it's the last magazine. And I've had so many of those moments where like I've had to look at my own mortality or the mortality of what it is that I'm doing, you know, like the music industry almost crashing multiple times. Your favorite band is suddenly breaking up. I have a print magazine that relies on free distro. You can't put it anywhere. I've had so many run-ins with my own mortality and then, you know, having a heart attack, things like this. I'm at the point now where I'm like, is this going to cause damage to myself worrying about this? And also, like you said, I think as well, and I have a lot of respect for a lot of these older artists and musicians and stuff that are constantly learning from new artists. And I'm even learning now. It's like, you know, I went and saw a consultant and she was only like 21 to show me about TikTok. Yeah, I can't believe I'm admitting that, but like...
That's awesome. That's good though.
Yeah, I was like, I'm not going to stand there and be like, oh, you industry people are only now hiring Gen Z kids. I'm like, well, how do I learn from them then? Like, how teach me? Like, hey, what's your consultancy fee? Bam, like, let's have a chat about it. And then sometimes, a lot of the time, I'll find even with those conversations, they'll come to me and be like, hey, like, how do I progress in consultancy? And I'm like, hey, there's this piece of knowledge. Like, again, to refer back to some of the older bands that I've more recently worked with, like, you know, even working with Rev, it was fantastic was to sit down with Sammy and Adam and be like, okay, Drain is doing this, how about we do that, you know? But I'm also learning from them, like, okay, no, like, this is how the vinyl pressing side works, this is how distro works, this is how that works. And so when you get things like that kid that's like, where is my record? I'm like, right, it's the amount of times I'm tempted to send an email that just reminds them that we're still in the height of a pandemic. I'm like, it's one of those, there are moments where I'm like, why did we move into vinyl? Like, why did we do this so much?
I love it though.
Yeah, exactly. That's what made me laugh about one of your podcasts is you're talking to someone who has no connection to this world. And you're like, yeah, so like when a hardcore kid doesn't get their 7-inch straight away, I was like, I've got to be on this podcast. I was like, I've got to have a conversation with this guy. But it is that. And I think it's taking that pinch of salt as well when people disappoint you, when people aren't reliable and come through for you. It is that thing of like being able to say, we're all human beings, but then it's also realizing and not being a pushover with that. On the flip side, I've had to fire journalists that I thought were great people, but you know, they never turned something in on time because they didn't respect that it was print, or they did something really stupid at a festival, or you know, even one guy, I thought he was a great social media manager. get to the border of France, he's got drugs on him. I'm like, what the hell, man? Like, I was just like, you have to step in with that tolerance as well and just say, because people sometimes think, right, because it's a music magazine, music journalism taken it seriously, it's all fun and games. Sometimes people, they don't like when I come at them and say, hey, it's a business. Hey, we can't afford that fee that you think just because we're print. Hey, I have a zero drug policy towards my towards my work. Yet that has something to do with once being straight edge, but still even then it's like I have no fear. Because if you walked into like a government job and you said that you had drugs on you and you were at the border of a country with them, they wouldn't tolerate that. I'm not going to, because at the end of the day, what's the worst situation? You get in trouble, you get to go back home. I, as a business, really take that on the nose. And it's not like it's a business where someone's handed it to me and I've never had to build it. Like, this is my 10 years of my life that's been built up. So if you don't respect that, it's the same as disrespecting me on a personal level. And so, like, again, it is that balance of don't take everything personally. But sometimes I have to take that step back and be like, this is damaging for the magazine, or this is damaging for the company, and I can't be associated with that. And you know what? The people that have given me the biggest backlash, and a lot of the time are the people where I've had to be like, hey, it's all fun and games and it's DIY, but actually it's also a business. They're some of the people that have given me the biggest backlash. And for years, you know, I'd be firm and I'd go straight away apologizing. And slowly but surely, I haven't followed up with, by the way, you still suck. I'm silent. I take a step back and I'm like, I will let them see this as a lesson, sink in. I'm always happy to give someone a second chance. Funnily, in the last 2 years, the magazine's grown that some of these people have just come out the shadows again. And I'm like, send them the general info email and they kind of get lost in that. So I'm not giving them an email, you know, and they're sort of sitting around and floating around in that. But I'm like, I'm not putting myself in a position where I can make those same mistakes again, even if it means that sometimes you have to be firm but fair with people. And annoyingly, when you come from DIY, firm but also fair doesn't always exist in some people's eyes.
You just said something I think is so important. And like, it's weird because like, it's not just punk and hardcore for me. It's like just the business world. Like, people who are doing something on one scale or not doing anything at all, but they're just like part of the audience or whatever it is. It's easy to criticize. And I talk about this a lot on the podcast. Anybody can criticize, but very few people can go out and start Discovered. Very few people can go out and start a band that actually goes and does things and has longevity. Very few people can go out and start a business that makes it. But anybody can criticize. Anybody can hammer you. And like, you got to make a decision when you're out there. And when you're putting yourself out there, you got to make a decision about like, I really believe in listening to criticism, totally. But like, again, it's like what I said to you earlier. Like, I don't listen to like some tweet of some kid, and I have in my life. I used to like take things so personally on the Bridge 9 board, and like I laugh now. It's like, well, who has a background in doing important stuff? But anyways, like the whole idea is if you're putting that out there, the goal for me is always to just focus on your shit and become undeniable. And when you're undeniable, then the critics are like, ooh, I wish I hadn't have said that. Or they pretend they didn't and they come back. And I think it's cool because Discovered's at that point where it's like, yeah, you know, of course people are going to say shit because they weren't the ones doing it. And they want the attention. They want the power. They want these things. They want everything to be spotlit on them. So they'll criticize other people. You just went out, you did something, it became undeniable. So they're coming back. And it's like, I love that you're firm but fair, because the fairness is also like, hey, listen, like, you know, it's pretty cowardly what you did or how you engage, but all right, I'll give you a chance. I like that approach, but that does bring me to something I want to talk to you about, which is gatekeeping.
Oh, yes, I'm very much. Yeah. Do you know what? I've just had a big debate with someone about this, but basically, if you're gatekeeping something, how do you ever expect it to expand? If you're saying to me, I can't, sorry, if you hear a cat meowing, I'm really sorry about him. He likes to announce whenever he comes into the house. But it's one of these of like, you know, if you're now saying, I can't cover this thing, then how is it ever going to get any coverage if you use that mindset? So like, I think gatekeeping is that, but obviously I also joke about it so much with my dad being an old punk and hardcore band, because I do it on the flip to him. We were in my local record store a few months back, and he pulls out a record of like Nothing, and he's like, oh, I love this new band. And I was like, oh my God, Dad, they're not new. Oh, like, you know, it was the flip reverse of gatekeeping. No, but he would joke around, like, you know, and he's done it in the past. He'll put on bands in the car, you know, like Big Cheese and Chubby and the Gang and all of these. And I'll be like, oh, you can't listen to this, you're old. And then I'll tell him about a band that I like from back in the day. And he goes, well, you wouldn't know. You know, so I have a great way to banter at it. So when I see it in real life, I'm like, wow, as if this is an actual thing people take seriously. You know, like I said, gatekeeping is, for me, when I think of the word gatekeeping, what I envision is like a dam. You know, when you see like cartoons and like somewhere's flooding and the doors are about to do this. Yeah. Sooner or later, gatekeep something all you want, it's gonna flood open, and everything that you've tried to gatekeep is gonna be out there in the open.
Yeah, gatekeeping's weird because, like, you know, I remember being like young in high school and someone was wearing an SNFU shirt, and I was like, they didn't appear to me to be a part of like the culture that I felt I had to defend. And I was like grilling them, like, name 3 songs. Like in high school, I did the thing that you see on the internet. That's like, oh, who's this idiot guy that does that? I did that in high school. And like, as I got older, you know, you learn, you're like, oh, what, you know, I was being an idiot. I was being not cool, like whatever it is. But like, you also, like, as I've gotten older, it's like, gatekeeping is such a natural thing. You care about something, you want to defend it. You want it to be yours. You want it to be your secret. Or someone says something that takes some shine off something that you're a part of, that you believe in, you kind of want to attack them. It's such a weird thing because like people care about things, but there's like your identity. Like I'll even think about the straight edge. It's like when someone stops being straight edge, there's that kind of like, oh, you kind of like left the club, you suck. But it's like, well, who cares? Like if someone wants to drink, it doesn't matter. Like, you know, it's like, there's so much stuff associated, I think, with like, especially like punk and hardcore. It's like, it's so much to do with your identity, but it's also a form of music you're into. Plus it's like, you know, it's supposed to be like this big open thing. Like there's so much confusion about it that when I come to like confused feelings about it, when I think about gatekeeping, I just think it's like, it's just the shitty part that exists in so many people. And it's like, I think anybody, like you were saying with your dad, it's like, you gotta like do this like weird gatekeeping thing. It's like, to talk about gatekeepers as if they're just some like evil clan of people that live in a cave and come out and they're like, you can't like youth of today, or you can't like this. It's like, no, like everybody, or a lot of people gatekeep and a lot of people can be shitty. It's like, can you be called on it and be humble enough to be like, oh my gosh, you're right, I'm doing that, I'm being an idiot? Or can you realize that if someone's doing it, it doesn't mean they're a bad person. They're just like, maybe I'm at a bad day, maybe they're being an idiot. Maybe a week from now, a year from now, they'll be a better person. It's like such a natural thing, but it gets talked a lot about as if there's types of people that they're the ones who do it, rather than like a lot of people do it. Maybe everyone does it. And like, maybe we can just get better at calling each other out in a positive way, and then all still like kind of like working it out together.
Gatekeeping in the sense of what you define it as there. So if you did look it up, I guess in a thesaurus, and what it means is to basically obviously say like, hey, I'm just saying, you can't be a part of this. For me, sometimes that means yet. Gatekeeping drove me. Like I was at a festival and it was nobody with punk and hardcore, and I asked this guy who was standing around in the backstage, was like, hey, do you know anyone, this band, what they looks like? I've got an interview with them. And he, word for word, I was saying this to some of the guys I manage, what keeps me driven in music was, I was like to him, I was like, hey, kid, well, he's like, yeah, I know what they look like. I've got so-and-so's number. Do you want me to contact them? I was like, yeah, that's great. I'm going to do an interview. And he went, nah, I'm not going to do it. And like, I remember just being stood there like, where do you get off on this? Like, what is the power play here that you're getting by? So when people, the worst people in this industry, in my total view, and I will say this confidently without regret, are the people that know they can help someone out and actively choose not to, with like zero intention. So for me, that's where like gatekeeping, it inspired me to keep going and being like, yeah, do you know what? Like, and again, meeting the Andrew Neufelds and the Sam Sieglers were like, hey, yeah, you should talk to Santa Cruz Skateboards, or like, you should talk to this person in Costa Rica and stuff like that. To me, that is the reason why those people are successful. So I always think if you're gatekeeping in a really narcissistic way, that's your own downfall. You're going to stay in your little dome, and you're not going to help anyone else. You know, the thing that you're trying to help by keeping the walls closed in that little dome, you're actually doing more damage for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to something you said early on. It costs nothing to be nice to someone. It costs nothing to be decent to someone. And being decent to people, it's not about getting something, but, you know, like more often than not, if you're decent to people, you'll be remembered for it. All right. So as we're closing off, I got 3 questions for you.
Go on. Yeah.
All right. The first, what advice do you have for someone who wants to make music, whether they're a musician or doing a magazine, like writing or artist management, anything? If someone wants to be involved in the business of music, what advice do you have for them?
Don't waste your money on a degree. I was on tour for 3 years and my lecturer was tapping in my ID. Like straight up, like I had one assignment that was like hand in a touring day sheet, and I literally took a picture of one. I was like, you cannot get more simple. No, in Venice, right? The thing is, it's things like these podcasts, right? Not me, by all means, but like, listen to entrepreneurs, talk to other magazine editors, talk to those people. Yeah, you're going to run into the magazine editors. They'll be like, why are you talking to me? I'm not giving you my business sense away. But like, it also on the flip, if you're that person that has a bunch of knowledge, go and do a university lecture. You're not above it. Go talk to that, reply to that kid's email that asked for a bit of advice. Don't fall too much down the rabbit hole. I always say sometimes a band is like, can you do this, this, and this for me? And I'm like, well, it's unfair if I start representing you so largely that the people that I do management with are kind of left in the dirt. Yeah, you got to have that balance. So for me, the main advice, like I said, it goes two ways. I advise to anyone in the industry that can help people and is willing and is open to it. It takes 2 minutes to change someone's day. You could see, don't be that guy at that festival that could have sorted out that interview. It wasn't a big band, so looking back, it's not too dramatic. But like, that's what I'll remember that guy for. If he walks into a boardroom tomorrow, I'll be like, oh, he's that guy. And I'm not going to want to work with him. And on the flip, if you want to get into this, watch Almost Famous, because it will teach you a lot of lessons about the reality of the rock and roll life. But also as well, it's like, just go for it. And I know that that's such a cliche, but like, you will spend more time will be wasted waiting and thinking around, oh, what if this goes wrong, than doing it, because you never know. I say this to every band as well. Like, if you're playing a show, play every show like it's your last. You wouldn't believe who might turn up at a local show, or, someone will see someone like, I'll run into a bar in Manchester, happen to be there, a band plays, they're sick. I could be that person that turns around to a booking agent. They don't know it. I'm in the crowd and be like, hey, you should get on this band. So I think that's definitely the main goal. But also, I think it's rare that people give the advice the other way around, which is, I keep myself in check with that. Sometimes someone's like, how, my, friends can be like, how do I do this, this, and this? And I'm like, okay, I'm busy, but I'm free on this day. This is my schedule. So again, it's having that work-life balance and being like, hey, I'm free on this day. Let's have a bit of a chat. Or again, when I start managing a band, I'm like, okay, what areas are you super good in? Oh, I'm amazing at social media. I'm well connected here. Ace, this is what I can also do. What are your weaknesses? And having that honest conversation, and also not thinking that you know everything. That's the biggest advice I have to new bands. Where I'm like, and even some of these way older bands are like, hey, you should try this. No. We've done this for 20 plus years. Like, we're going to stick with it this way. By the way, that's no one that I've ever worked with, because I wouldn't work with someone like that. But like, I've ran into that situation a lot, or like old label heads and stuff. It's that, and I check myself constantly on that. It's like, I should be learning about this. I should be listening to these people's stories. And in music, we had the big thing with like Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. We have to listen to other people. So that's it. It's like, keep your ears turned on at all times. Be aware. Also, if you wanted to get into journalism specifically, you don't need to interview the biggest band straight away, because that band or artist that you help out that's got like 500 streams, but you love their music. If you love their music and you're that passionate about them, you can become an essential tool in their story of success.
Hell yeah. That's so great. Okay. Second question, going back to you as a 15-year-old, after all these years working in the music industry, what's the same about you as that when you were 15, but what's different about you? So now that from the moment when you're like almost famous, that's what I want to do, that's where I want to go. What's the same? What is the same about you as that 15-year-old that hasn't changed, but what has changed about you?
To be lighthearted, what has changed? I wonder if I'll stay awake for an 11 p.m. set. European festivals, people going on stage at 11 p.m. I'm like, oh, well, I guess I'm not watching Jawbreaker then. Like, there's that. My tolerance towards being a big people pleaser has changed. That's one of the big things, is like, there were so many people that early on that I really respect, like publicists, like, shout out Emma Van Deutz, for example, very firm. For many years, I was like, God, she probably hates me. But she was right. She wasn't giving me the big band straight away, because she was proving to me, you got to work your way up. And it's like, I think that reflecting in those people that, like I said, I always say I was raised by some of these people in the industry. They're like, I always say I was raised by the music industry, just because my age getting into it to now. And it's like, the people that I probably thought were massive assholes or jackasses in the beginning for being firm, I'm definitely becoming that person. Not with like mean intent or anything, but my tolerance to BS has drastically dropped. But what has stayed the same I'll give you an example, right? That's the best way I always find to do it. I walked into, I was jet lagged as hell, everything like this. Atlanta's probably not the best city in the world. And I walk in, and One Step Closer are playing as the opener for the first night of the Comeback Kid tour. And I stood there, and I was like, hey, I'll go say hello to everyone. But I was like, no, I want to watch this set. And I watched them, and that buzz, I was like, wow, that's not changed. I felt like the 15-year-old me was stood in that room at that moment and was like, this is sick. And I think that's something that, even as I've got older and the politics of the industry's got involved and the drama of business and the politics of business, it's something that will never take away from 15-year-old me. In fact, when I go through a dark patch in my career or I find I'm struggling, I actually put Almost Famous on, because by the end of it, I'm like, it boils down to that question. And I ask myself this a lot, whether it's journaling or just mentally every now and then, is when that William Miller kid sits down with the musician at the end and he says, Russell, what do you love about music? That is a question I will never be able to answer, because the answer is just that big. And that I'm going to take to the grave with me.
All right. That's an awesome answer. And yeah, you know what? A band, a set, a song, can change your day, can change your life. So that's cool. All right. Last question. I am not going to hold you to this. Your answer could change 5 minutes from now. But.
Right.
3 to you at this moment, 3 most important UK hardcore records.
Oh, do we have to? Mate, no, I'm really bad with record title names. I could give you bands.
Okay, give me bands. Give me bands.
Right, give me bands. Right. Okay, without bias, XL Life is doing the boundaries things and like breaking things out. So there's them. Big Cheese. Big Cheese are like or as my now parents who live in France call them, the Large Fromage. That's my favourite name for them. I love that band to pieces. Like, they're so good. Solidly, I feel like the Flex is one of these I debate about, because they come and go. Like, I'm not sure if they've broken up and then they're announced on a show, and I friggin' love them. Like, they get on stage and you're just like, you're just left in a bewildered way of like, what on earth? But if I can throw in a fourth is... No, I can't think of a fourth. And it's not because I'm not, up to date with UK hardcore or UK punk bands. It's just there's so many. No, The Chisel. Right, if I can go in with one last one, The Chisel is everything that I've loved about growing up in a household with working class parents embodied into it. And it's like that. When I say that I'm firm but fair, my mum used to say this saying to me, which is like, if you don't like me, tough luck. Like, if she was making a decision that as a kid I hated, she'd say that. So when The Chisel came out with The Chisel, Nuff Said, I was like, yeah, I get behind that,
Yeah, huge respect to The Chisel. New record is totally killer. And this like UK hardcore from like, all the way back to like bands like Understand to like Dead and Gone, and everyone that's involved in Dead and Gone, all the current bands, Chubby and the Gang, Big Cheese, Chisel, Rated X. You could go on and on. There's just so many great bands. Oh, and High Vis, who are so sick. I love
Honestly,
High Vis.
I think that they are going to be absolutely massive. And do you know what? If I'm going to end this thing on anything, it's actually normally, I could go off and quote all these great musicians, whatever. It's actually something that Graham said. So he was playing Concrete Culture, which if people don't know about it, it's like skateboarding and music colliding in one spot in the name of like raising money for charity, saving DIY spaces. He was on stage and he stops mid-set, and in this like thick Liverpudlian accent, which is probably why it stuck in my head, he turns around and he's just like, I almost went to do an impression, but I'd be terrible and he'd probably hate me for it. But he turns around and he's just like, this is the great thing about where hardcore is at. We don't necessarily sound it, but we have that ethos so everyone here digs it. And like that I love. The biggest thing that I hate is the gatekeeping of people saying punk is a genre and not an ethos, because are you going to stand there and tell me that Angel Dust and like Incendiary sound the same? Sure as hell they don't. So like, stop gatekeeping that punk is just a genre. So yeah, High Vis is the best example for that in my eyes.
I first heard of them via your coverage of them, and then my friend Chris, who I play in a band with, was like, "Oh, you got to check out this record." Anyways, all right. As we're wrapping up, let's hype up some of your stuff. Where can people find your stuff?
So, do you know what? It was fun and games changing our logo to an abbreviation until I had to spell it out. And every time I listen to Jeremy Boll's podcast, I fast forward the intro because it pains me. But Discovered, like on every social media, it is just the word Discovered Magazine. Web store, DSCVRD.co. Please put a link somewhere.
We'll link you up.
Oh my gosh, please, there's that. In terms of like other stuff going on, like I said, it's the 10th anniversary. We've actually, for the very first time in a long time, returned to live events. We got some really cool brands involved. We're actually doing galleries of, like I said, I don't think photographers and painters and album design people get enough attention. So when we had the option to team with, I really can't say anything till April. But when we had the chance to team with this big brand and get a budget to work with these people, I was like, we can't just have a bunch of live shows. Let's showcase some other people in the scene's work. So we've got that coming up. And I think, I'm gonna let a little spoiler in because I love both of these bands. New issue is out. This will probably be out by then, actually. New issue is out Friday. Comeback Kid are on the cover. And to do with the culture thing, that was shot by myself from the top of a very, very high skate bowl in the House of Vans. That's the only time I've been like, someone stand behind me because I'm gonna stack it into this bowl. And we got Soul Blind on the cover. On the flip, it was like, that's an example of Ricky introduced me to their vocalist at the New York show, who's such a sound dude, and like what they're doing with bringing the Alice in Chains world into hardcore. I was like, and that happened over text message. I was like, hey, Ricky, should we put Soul Blind on the cover? He's like, yeah, sick, let's make it happen. So I'm excited for that. We're also going to have a really big cultural shift in the magazine in terms of going hard on covering skateboarding and cultural crossovers. And that's happening in April. And again, that's like our secret weapon. So I can't go into it too much. But yeah, that's where everything's at.
All right. Awesome. Well, everyone, please check out Discovered. Please check out Reclaim Music Group. And Georgia, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for everything you're doing for the scene. And also just like, cool, like go out and doing your stuff, like doing it your own way, having the guts to do it. And of course, support all the bands. Shout out Endgame, Spencer. We love you. All right. That's it, everyone. We'll see you in the outro. Spencer, drop the beat.